Hello and welcome to another video from the only channel you need to not only survive the current apocalypse but actually enjoy it. And today's video is going to be the next installment in my net making video series. In particular, today we will be making mesh knots in a cast net. Now if you look at a cast net, it looks like every single knot is exactly the same knot. And there's a good reason for that. Nearly every knot in a cast net is the same knot. It is the mesh knots that we make in our mesh rows, as well as the mesh knots that appear in our widening rows. I think that nearly every kind of net that exists on this planet is, for the most part, going to be made out of mesh knots. And that includes all kinds of fishing nets, nets used for trapping animals on land, as well as game nets like the basketball goal nets and tennis nets. So the mesh knot that you're going to learn today is a very, very useful knot in making nets. This is the net that we started with a single line, heavy gauge line, and I've already gotten past my first widening row, and I'm on my way into the next mesh row after my first widening row. And I apologize that I was unable to show you how to do this from the start, but that's okay. In about a minute I'm going to show you what I'm doing using our heavy gauge line, and I'm talking about that really heavy, almost rope, so that you can see the details of what's going on here. As you do this more and more, you'll get a feel for whether or not you're doing it right, and you'll get a feel for when you've got one line too slack, or when the net's starting to go crooked, or any of those kind of things. You know, don't worry about it at first, because at first this is going to be a really tough ordeal trying to just remember how to tie the knot, but you'll get over that pretty quick. It doesn't take too long. If you can get all the way through a net, you're pretty much an expert. When I get to the end of this row, depending on how much line is left on my needle, I'll either cut it and start my light line, or I'll try to make it across one more time. It looks like I'll run out shortly after I finish this row, so there's a very good possibility that I'm going to do this row and then just cut the line and drop down to a number 4, maybe. I think that's my plan, if I got number 4 line around here. The knot that most net makers use to put these together is exactly the same as the knot I'm tying, but I'm tying it in a very simple pattern. As you progress, hopefully I'll progress, and I'll be able to show you the proper way to do this. It's called the Flying Dutchman technique. Flying Dutchman technique will put the same line, or the same knot, on your net. It'll just be facing the other direction. And the reason the Flying Dutchman is better is because if you can teach somebody how to do it, the knots will all hold without a whole lot of thinking. With this simple knot, you pretty much have to guide it with your thumb and forefinger, or pointing finger, to make it go to the right spot. The Flying Dutchman, it's going to go to the right spot on its own. Now we're near the end, and I don't think I have enough line to go all the way back across again. And from here to here is probably enough heavy line to support the rest of the net anyway. A lot of guys that make nets will only go down maybe 3 rows before they transition into a lighter line. And but me, I like my net to be a little more stout. The light line allows your net to sink quicker. So this is really not a big issue. I could go 3 more rows with heavy line, it wouldn't hurt anything. But just because I don't think I have enough line to make it back across another time, I'm going to go ahead and tie in with some number 4 line if I have it, because that's pretty good size line for me. We are now ready to tie our final header knot. So we're going to come over the top of our gauge or mesh board, go back through our ring, pull it up until our knots are level with one another, and we're going to tie our knot. This knot, like all of our other header knots, will be double, so we have to go through our loop twice. And there you have it. At this point, we have to take our needle and start going the other way. And since we always knit from left to right, the first thing we have to do is turn our ring around. Now, if we're left-handed, we'll be going from right to left. We're going to remove our gauge board, or mesh board, and we're going to start making knots beneath our headers. The way we're going to start our first mesh knot is to go on top of our gauge board with the line that is connected to our needle. And instead of coming through our ring, we're going to come through our first loop produced by our headers. The way that we're going to determine exactly where to place our first mesh knot is by simply putting tension on our needle until it pulls our mesh board up to the loop formed by our header. Once that loop is resting firmly on top of our gauge, we'll make a knot. Since we're no longer tying headers, we don't have to double, although I know people who do double it. You're going to need to guide your knot up using your pointing or index finger and thumb. If you don't, your knot will not hold. And you're going to continue to make meshes all the way across in the same way. Simply throw a loop over your work and come up on the other side of your loop. You will continue to tie your mesh knots until you get back to the other side of your net. Now, it is very important that you tie these knots correctly or they will not hold. We'll now take a look at a video that I made of this knot using two different colors of line to show you what a knot should look like when it's tied properly and what a knot will look like when it's tied improperly. Alright, we pull our line down, and I'm going to show you the proper way to tie this, if I can, with this unbonded line. And we're going to guide this line down with our thumb and index finger, because when we get done, we want both knots to interact with one another. If you notice, the white line and the black line are tied into each other. In other words, the white line isn't simply tied onto this line. And I'm going to show you what I mean, because if you don't do this right, you're going to have some problems. So we're going to do it wrong right now. I'm getting ready to show you the wrong way. Just keep in mind, this is the wrong way. Okay, we're going to tie it. This time we're not going to guide it with our finger. We're just going to let it go where it wants to go. And by nature, it is not going to want to go where it's supposed to go. Okay, let's see if you can tell the difference between these two knots. This is why I use two different colors of line. You can see that by guiding that line onto the top of that knot, you end up with the top part being part of the knot and the bottom part being part of the knot. If you do it without guiding it, all you have is a knot on your white line, or your bottom line, and tied to this. That's a slip knot. That doesn't, and not only that, but it will come untied. In fact, any knot you put in is going to come untied if it wants to. But we're gonna make sure you got the best possible chance of that not happening. Okay, I'm gonna show you a few other things that you're gonna run into. The only reason I'm showing them to you is so that you don't freak out when you see your work, because all these problems are easily fixed. Okay, these are two separate headers, but occasionally, just by accident, you'll just pick one up and you won't even know you're doing it, and it looks like this is really obvious, and it is because we're using large line. But if you're using a small line, then it's not going to be that obvious, and you're going to do it. Don't even think that this is a problem that you're not going to have, because you are going to have it. I got a house full of nets that are full of this. Okay, in some situations you want to tie a knot like that, but normally if you're making a cast net, this is called a reducer or a shrinking knot. And what that's just done is it's taken two meshes from the top and tied them into one. So right here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We're going to end up with 6 down here because we just reduced our net by tying two meshes together. But if you are going along looking at your net and you see you've got a header and a mesh, a header and a mesh, a header and a mesh, and then suddenly you got two headers leading to one mesh, then just know that that's what you did. Now you can keep going. You won't have a perfect net. You can just skip over. When you will not find this until you get to the end, turn around and come back. So by the time you find this, the only fix you're going to have is to go back and cut out, who knows, maybe 250 meshes to fix this. Or you can simply try to cut it off right here and fix it. And in fact, I've done that several times. You can just cut this knot off and put in an extra piece of line there if you're real picky. Some people, you're not that picky, especially if you take and get 4 or 5 rows down before you realize you did it. But that's a mistake. If you see it, just know that that's what you did. You tied two meshes together. And if it's not that far, like see right here, I'm only going to have 2 meshes before I come back and find it. I can just untie my line all the way back and start over from this point. Another problem you might have, occasionally, now it doesn't look like it's easy here because the lines aren't laid out the way they would be with a normal net. But sometimes you'll be going to come through here to tie your next mesh, and you'll accidentally pick up something from the other side of the net. Now this is something that's going to be real easy to see because even before you tie the knot, you'll notice that something ain't right. And if you don't, normally by the time you go to your next mesh, you'll notice something ain't right. But that's a common problem that happens. The next mistake that I'm about to show you is a mistake that you will find in every cast net ever made. Well, that's actually an exaggeration. I've made a cast net without doing this mistake, but if I did, I don't remember it. But you'll be talking to somebody or watching TV, and you go to make your next mesh, and you pull it on down. Well, what's the next step? Once we pull that down, we're going to tie our knot, right? But we forget, and we go on to the next one. And we do remember to tie this one. And we go to the next one and we remember to tie that one, right? We're not going to notice that we missed that knot. It just ain't going to happen. You will never know that you missed tying that knot until you turn this thing over, right? And we're going to go for our next mesh row. So we pull our gauge out. Or reposition our camera a little bit. And we come over the top of our mesh board, come down here into the first mesh, and we're going to tension the line until we pull that loop down onto the top of the mesh board. Tie another knot. Go to tie another knot. And hey, what's going on here? That ain't working. Well, the reason it ain't working is because we didn't tie our knot before. But here's a solution to that. You pull this down tight and you hold it with your thumb while pulling this back up. And you kind of just eyeball it. You know, you might even want to grab the other side and just make sure you got enough to do what you're going to do. Then tie this off. Just hold it with your thumb until you get it tight. Then when you go up on the other side, that'll kind of anchor it. I'm showing you this because you're going to do it. And when you do it, you're going to probably freak out because you don't know how to fix it, but it's easy to fix. So we've gone all the way across. We're going to pull this apart and take a look at it. See, it's not really a problem. If you get these two knots to seat good, then the fact that this is loose up here is not going to be an issue. You know, especially one thing about it, this is near the top of the net, so no fish is going to try to get out through the top because within seconds of throwing this thing, all of these lines for about 2 or 3 feet down are going to be out of the water, so fish ain't even going to be up there. But the chances of a fish finding that particular loop, because see, if he's a small enough fish and he pulls that down, he's going to get through there. But the chances of him finding it are so slim that it's not that big of a deal. Now, if you're super paranoid about it, I'm sure there's got to be some kind of way to tie some kind of knot around that, and then maybe put some super glue on it or melt it or something. But I don't even worry about it. When I do that, I just work around it and leave it in there. And the net looks good when it's hanging. Got a big clump of stuff on there? Maybe not. Now I'm going to show you a mistake that only happens to someone who is very, very new to net making. Now, if you've been making nets for a while, and by a while I mean just a couple of months, you're going to get to the point where you're instinctively tying your knots. You simply go to the next loop and put your half hitch in and go to the next loop, and you're not even going to really be thinking about it. But when you're new, every move you make takes incredible concentration. So you'll actually have to think of, when you get done, you'll have to think of, where do I go on this board? Well, you go over the top, right? So then you know that your needle has to go under, but you get here and you think, well, I think it has to go over the top. And you'll do that thinking, well, that doesn't look right, but maybe, well, let's just see. Oh yeah, I got to go in here and do this. And this whole process is going on without thought. You know, you're not talking about this to yourself. You're just trying to feel the knot out because you're not used to it. It's not instinctive. And so you go on and you think through each knot on the ones that come afterwards. And say you eventually get to the end of your row that what you're doing is time to pull the knots out of your gauge. Well, what you're going to end up with is this one loop that's really, really large, and that's going to boggle your mind. You're going to be thinking, there's no way in the world I did that. My board isn't big enough. How did I do that? Because you're not even aware that you went around your board twice. Well, if you're new to netting, every one of these knots takes a full minute. Eventually you'll be doing them in 5 seconds. But you've got a lot invested. If you've gone all the way to the end of the net and you're on your way back and you find this, you don't want to have to cut the whole thing out. Well, there's a way to save this. And you're simply going to shorten the size of this. Now, you know you want to tie up in here somewhere. So we're going to go ahead and cut this off. And simply do a square knot right here, just like we're joining two new pieces of line. And we're going to try to just eyeball it. Pull it down and compare it to the ones next to it. There you go. Like it never even happened. Now all you have to do is cut off the ends of your line and take your lighter and melt them. And you'll have a perfect net, just with one extra knot. Now we'll be continuing the net we started in our last video using double line. I already explained that in the past a man making a net may not have had a light line to use at the bottom and a heavy line to use at the top, so he may have used a light line for the whole net and just simply doubled up at the top. Someone doing that back then would have probably had two white lines, but we have the option of purchasing line of different colors. I highly recommend that if this is your first net, you don't try doing this, and certainly don't try it with one color of line. It's confusing enough just with the two different colors. All right, we're going to do the same thing on this double line as we did with our single line, but we're going to try to keep our work straight. We're going to go over the top of our mesh board, come up through our first loop that is formed by our header, previous header. We're going to pull down both lines evenly, and we're going to go ahead and tie ourselves a knot, just like we're using single line, but we are going to have to maintain both lines equal. And we don't have to double up or not, like we did at the top. In fact, having double line actually makes it kind of like a double knot. All right, just keep going. Use your other hand to try to keep from getting too much confusion in here. And as bad as this seems, it actually is worse when you're actually doing it. No, it's not really that bad. I hope I get to finish this net. I haven't been spending a whole lot of time making nets lately, and I got probably about 5 of them started. But just remember, as you're working with this double line, you're going to be having to constantly straighten this out so that you don't end up making something that looks like a tangled mess. Keep everything equal. Might want to pull them down individually, especially when it's time to tighten them up. Just like with a single line net, we're going to have to make sure to keep everything spaced evenly, and to be taking meshes off the end of our mesh stick or gauge as we go, so that we don't end up making our net crooked. I was really proud of this when I finished making just the header row. If I can get all the way to the other end with these meshes, I'm really going to be proud. Remember, a very important lesson is to make sure that you hold your knot down tight with your 2 fingers so that you can guide the knot up to the top of your gauge board. Otherwise, your knots are going to slip. In fact, they're going to try to slip anyway, but we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that you have as little of that problem as possible. Okay, you see how you got a green line? It's pretty tight, and the white line's a big loop, so we're going to take that white line down to about the same size as the green and just kind of work them together. Hold them with your thumb and pointing finger and get it to sit right on top of your gauge. But as you get farther down the net, you're not going to have as much trouble with your line going around your attachment point on your work table. If you notice, I almost went through there with the back of the needle. That actually isn't a problem. And some needles actually don't have a front and a back, or a top and a bottom, or whatever you want to count it. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I'll go ahead and demonstrate that right now. Okay, there's where we're going to go, right? It's not an issue to take your needle through backwards. It's just that the design of the needle makes it easier to go through with this point, because sometimes your work is so tight that you have to kind of work your way through with that pointy end. Remember, you got to keep on spreading them out. Make sure you're not grabbing 3 and 4 loops at the same time with this kind of a mess. This is going to be a very beautiful net when I'm done. You know, I fish with my nets, but really feel uncomfortable throwing one of these anywhere where it could get snagged or torn, because they really are a work of art. There aren't very many of them left, and so I'm very, very particular about nets that are handmade in general, especially a net that's made by somebody else. I've got friends that have made nets for me, and I just scared to death of tearing one of those up because I know they're irreplaceable. But when we get done here, this is going to be something worth hanging on the wall. If you're making a net that's large enough for fishing, there is absolutely no way to make the entire net with one loaded needle. You're going to eventually run out of line, and when you do that, you're going to have to reload your needle and tie back into your net. Now, a lot of people, including myself, when they're first starting, will take the line on the spool, tie it into the net, and then try to figure out how to get it on the needle. It cannot be done. You load your needle first, then you tie onto your line. Now, I've already told you that you're going to have to use square knots anytime you tie 2 pieces of line together, so you probably already know that. But what you might not know is how to, where you want to place your knot, because that's important. Okay, here we have our square knot, and the way we're going to tell that it's a square knot is by looking at it. Is it square? That is a square knot. And it does this. So but we got to get this knot as close to this knot as possible, and the reason for that is it has to be out of our way before we can continue making our net. So we're gonna take and pull on that line while working this line with our hand. And it's kind of tedious, and sometimes you could spend 5 minutes just trying to get this line as tight as you can. If you got that knot down inside of the loop, like say that knot was down in here somewhere, when you go to tie your next row on, that knot's going to get in the way and it's going to throw your geometry of your net off, and you don't want that. You want to keep a nice, consistent, clean geometry. If you see, we're getting it up there real close to that knot. So we've got our lines tied up. Now we want to cut them and melt them. And that melting actually holds it together, so you can't skip this step, because this line right here, even if these were both bonded, that would eventually slip off. Something I've learned is if you're under a ceiling fan, you got to turn the ceiling fan off, and if you're outside and it's windy, you have to take it inside and do this, because a lot of times you just ain't gonna be able to keep your lighter lit in the wind. But we're gonna try it. And same warning I always give: do not let that stuff drip on your hands, because it will burn you, and it'll leave a hole in you that'll last for a while. I like to burn it all the way down to the other rope without setting the other rope on fire, which is normally string. Now this would normally be the same color line. I just did that so you could see how that was put together. And then we're going to go on with the net like nothing's wrong. There will be occasions when your mesh board falls out of your net while transporting it, or for any other reason. You may also be forced to remove your mesh board in order to make some kind of repair to something that you messed up. But when that happens, for a beginner, it can be very confusing how to reinsert your mesh board. So we're going to explain that right now. If you take a look at your net and you find where your needle is connected, then you simply look at which side hangs lower, and you know which side you worked on last. Since this is lower than this, we know that this is where we ended our work. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our mesh board and stick it down through the top of the previous mesh, twirl it around and go through the top of the mesh right before that, and if it makes us feel good, we can actually go down through the next one. Reality is you only have to be on one, but I always feel better with a few of them on there. Once we do that, all we have to do is pull our line back over the top of the mesh board, come up through our previous mesh, or our next mesh, pull it down, and continue on as if nothing happened. I've spoken a little bit about problems that can happen while you're actually knitting your net. However, just the act of transporting your net can cause problems that are every bit as hard to figure out. When you go from one location to another, which can happen if you're knitting indoors and realize it's a nice day and you want to go outdoors, or like myself, when I take my net to the Fisherman's Museum to do knitting demonstrations. Transporting the net can cause your net to become tangled in ways that seem impossible to fix. But really, there are only two things that can go on in a net while it's being transported to cause problems. So any problem that you encounter will be caused by one or the other, or both of the things I'm about to show you. Sometimes, when you're transporting a net, one half of the net will come across on the ring. Still looks just right, but it isn't. It's a mess. And you're going to be kind of confused by this if you're new to net making. The simple solution to this is to find the ends, where your needle is tied on or where your tail is left from starting the net, and simply separate it. Just like it never happened. Another problem that's a little bit more confusing is when your net does this. Half of the net, or part of the net, will go through the ring, leaving a mess that looks like that. This is a little bit more difficult to figure out, but if you just take your time and carefully look at your net, you can figure out where the twist is and easily untwist it. Just know that when you transport your net, if it gets in a knot, it can be fixed. To anyone who knows how to make a mesh knot, this video may seem extremely long, since it really doesn't take that much to figure out how to make a mesh knot. But once you start making mesh knots, you're actually making a net. So at this point, it's important to know as much as you can in order to get out of any binds you might get yourself into. Because even though I'm normally here and you can type me a little comment, ask me a question, all I can do is type back, and it's a whole lot easier to show you what I'm talking about now than to try to figure out a way to type what you need to do later. When we started our net, we started with 33 of these. These are called headers. Underneath each header, and the loop itself is the header, is our header knot. So if we've got 33 loops, we're going to end up with 33 knots, and that's this row right here. Those are our header knots. 33. The reason we're putting 33 in is because when we increase the size of our net, we're going to put in 11 wideners. That'll increase our net from 33 to 44. And in fact, as we go down the net, every time we come to a widening row, we're going to add 11 more. So it'll increase every single time to a number that can be divided by 11. But initially, that's not going to work out, because as we're tying our net, we're going to actually be only putting 32 knots underneath each one of these headers. And I'll show you why. If we have a header here and a header here, the next knot that we tie is going to be between the two. So as we go across, we're not going to tie another header on the other side, or another mesh on the other side of that header. We're just going to stop there. So we end up with 33 header knots, but only 32 mesh knots. And another 32 mesh knots, and another 32 mesh knots. And when we finally get to our widening row, we're actually going to be increasing not to 44, but to 43. And we're going to show you right now why that's the case. First, we're going to spread our net out into a perfect circle, or as best we can. With our net spread out like this, we can start to get an idea of how this is all going to finally work out. If you notice, near the center where the ring is, the headers are very close together. But when we actually get down into our first meshes, we'll notice that they're a little bit further spaced apart. We get to the next row of meshes a little bit further, and we'll keep getting further and further out until our meshes actually begin to approach the shape of a square. Now, I only tied 3 rows of meshes before I tied my widener rows. I could have gone 6 or 7 rows easily, and it probably would have been okay. We'll talk about that more in our next video, which is going to be specifically about wideners. But the point we're trying to understand now is how this whole thing comes together so that we have 33 knots all the way down to our first widening row. Because remember, we put 33 headers on, but we didn't get 33 meshes out of those headers, because the meshes are only tied between the headers. So this mesh knot is between these two headers, but there isn't a mesh knot between these two headers, but we're going to take care of that. Now, just to explain something so you're not too confused, this knot is not a header knot. This is simply a spot where I tied on because I was ready to change colors. If this was all tied with one color of line, there would be no knot here. But when we go to put our net together, we're going to do what's called sewing the two sides together. This is the little tail piece that we left on when we first started our net. This is our very first knot that we tied. Now, once the net is completed, we're going to go look for a long side, because each of these meshes has 4 knots in it. 1, 2, 3, 4, right there. But some that are near the edge do not have 4 knots, like this one. 1, 2, 3. And as we said, this is just a color change. So even this one only has 3 knots. 1, 2, 3. But we're going to come across with this tail piece. We're going to tie a square knot on there so we have a full needle of line. We're going to tie on to this long line that only has, this mesh that only has 3 knots. And we're going to go across and look for another mesh that only has 3 knots, and here it is. So we're going to tie into that. Once we do that, we're going to look for another long line on the other side. I'm going to do the same thing, and we're going to continue on down. Like I said, we're going to have this line on our needle, and we're going to go all the way down until the whole net is tied together. If you notice, now our 32 mesh knots have turned into 33. Our 32 mesh knots down here have turned into 33. Same thing here. We've got 32 mesh knots. By tying a knot here, we're going to come up with 33. And until we get down to our first widening row, every row will be 33. After that, it'll be 44 until we get to the next widening row, where we will have 55. Every row that has wideners, every widener row, will have an additional 11 knots and an additional 11 meshes. And that will be true all the way to the bottom of the net. No matter how many meshes we end up with, if we make a perfect net, every single row will be divisible by 11. Now that you're making meshes, it can actually be said that you're making a net, because a square net or a rectangular net requires nothing more than the ability to make regular meshes. However, many nets have to be shaped. The net we're making right now is going to eventually be shaped like a great big circle. So we're going to need some way of altering the shape of our net. And the way we're going to do that is with wideners. The next video in this series will be about making widener rows. You don't want to survive. Don't listen to me.